Good morning. The other thing the speakers have in common this morning is they're all called Simon. So it's about Simon Says as a view about energy. So I'm Simon Daniel. I'm founder of Moixa. Moixa is the word axiom backwards. So I tend to rethink how things are done in light of changing markets and changing assumptions. And energy is going through this big transition in terms of how we produce and use energy in different locations. And we're interested in managing all the world's batteries, starting from a very logical point in the home. Moixa makes a smart battery, which is very compact, so it's like a Dell computer size, designed to be installed in an hour in any home. We're interested in 99% of utility customers, not the 1%, some of our competitors target. We make a platform which aggregates all these batteries so they can look like a big container battery or a pumped hydro plant at grid scale by managing distributed assets so they can work collectively as a collective resource. And we're also integrating into our platform other forms of batteries and electric vehicles. And what we do with this is then operate batteries on behalf of customers. In the UK, the smart meters are funded by a meter asset provider and then managed by a meter operator. We are the first battery operator. We'll work with financiers to own batteries, and then we operate battery for behind the meter benefits to end customers such as homes, for self-consumption, for night tariff access, for backup, for simple rate arbitrage, and then for at-the-meter services to utilities who can use a battery for rate arbitrage or imbalance or half-hourly settlements or customer acquisition or smart activity. A battery is in the home for several decades, like a boiler. It forms a node in a smart home relationship. It's a persistent relationship with the household. And then we can also manage these batteries for local-to-meter benefits for the network operator to alleviate constraints, to reduce peak solar, to reduce peak EV use. And we can also share the battery for local resources to integrate solar and wind on a community level such that they can co-locate with batteries in homes. And then we also do front-of-meter services by aggregating batteries so they can do capacity and frequency. To some extent, those services which are very popular today are quite competitive, and there's a limited need for them in the national grid. Although the volume's growing, other forms of resources like electric vehicles can participate in them. Whereas a household always pays a certain amount for energy, and a battery in a home is therefore used every hour, every day, 365 days a year for home services. And then occasionally when there's a constraint for local services, and occasionally on a contract for grid services. So they have a balanced economic, and we've been doing a lot of tests. We have about 1,000 of these batteries out in the UK, and we've been testing lots of income streams across the full service stack. UK is a very interesting market because you can do all these services here in a very good regulatory market. We're also an island, and so we have to get it right because the volatility is very, very difficult to manage for renewables. But I wanted to step back and talk briefly about how I got here. I'm interested that Vanessa was at Accenture. I was at Accenture when I invented this keyboard because I didn't like carrying around large laptops and things, which were then called luggables. But this took me on a journey of looking at how billions of internet things are going to evolve. And so I first off invented this, and I then sold that, and that sold a few million units. And so I then sort of invented some other products, like a folding mouse, which I think Microsoft has made a version of, and flexible tablets, which were rolled up, and then modular smartwatches. This is about 2003-04. And then, then a sort of ecosystem where some of these devices could do things like this is a disaster patterned on UAVs and smartwatches, all connecting in mesh networks. But I realized when I showed them to people like Johnny Ive in 2004, we 3D printed a smartwatch, that it was very difficult to actually make it because of the batteries. And also, all these devices have batteries in. The device format may keep on changing, but the Internet of Things is full of billions of batteries, and there must be a better way to manage those. The other thing we noticed is the way we power these devices is shifting. They're no longer mains powered, they're DC powered, and it's now you have the ubiquitous USB supply. And it's quite interesting that USB is now multi-voltage, and so can do 100 watts and up to 30 volts. And so Apple AirBook powers via a USB protocol, and that's really interesting for the future of how devices are powered. You used to produce energy at a pumped hydro plant or Niagara Falls and transmit it over long distance at high voltage AC to use in high load mechanical devices. Whereas today you can produce power from a solar panel or building integrated solar, and you use it for very low power devices, DC type of products. And so there is a shift going on, and I think Simon recognizes how that's very applicable in Africa. There's a power escalator, what you can do for 2 watts a day, 10 watts a day. You get education, you get work, you get access. But power is falling, but we're also leaving more of these things on all the time. And so we then looked at sort of the ecosystem for energy, and this is a 2008 patent on how to integrate smart batteries with both a DC power supply and an AC power supply and integrate different renewables, including cars. And that was, it's reasonably early in its comprehension. It's cited very well by a lot of companies because everyone is thinking about smart technology. And if we look at some of the people who look at these patents, it gives a very good Rolodex of companies in the world making technology for this space. And then we've been looking at how we then manage these batteries. So the battery is a central node in a home platform. And so our platform is managing our battery and then is aggregating third-party batteries and EVs and is looking at what we do with that as ecosystem. This is a smart island project we're currently doing on the Isle of Scilly with Hitachi, where we're doing our VPP. Hitachi's doing a VPP and Passive's doing a VPP. Our VPP manages the electricity, the in-home battery resources, the EVs and the batteries. Passive manages the heat, and Hitachi manages the data flow and in part connections to WPD. This is an island. It has an interconnect to WPD. This interconnect breaks, and therefore the whole island has to be self-balancing on diesel or renewables. UK is an island. We've got a few interconnects to Europe, which we're cutting off or breaking, and therefore we're very exposed. And what works in the UK is therefore a good ecosystem for the world. UK is a very interesting test bed for renewable energy. It's a big island. Japan is a big island. Singapore is an island. But also it's very good representation of, say, a large US city in the middle of nowhere. So, or Chicago is like a big island. And if you look at cities in Australia, they're big islands. And so what works in our smart city or smart island is a very good test bed for the world. And therefore, some of the technologies demonstrated here have global export potential because we're many, many years. We had TEPCO invest in Moixa very recently because UK is 7 to 10 years ahead in the regulation for what Japan's going through in deregulating utilities. We actually view Germany as 7 years ahead of UK in terms of renewables. We call Germany the ghost of Christmas future because it shows what happens if you stuff lots of renewables into your grid. The grid stops working because on a solar day there is no kilowatts flowing through the grid, and therefore they had to pay Austria $3 billion a year to take their energy. But they can also use France as a battery backup. So stuff which works in Germany isn't as necessarily portable to the world because it is actually using its ecosystem. Whereas in the UK, we have to be better at balancing it as an island to make it work. But we've been looking about how do we manage wider classes of batteries. And I went back to sort of how much batteries are made. And last year, about 90 gigawatt hours of lithium batteries are made. There's also quite a lot, there's more than that made in lead acid batteries going into cars. And there's a projection this would be a quarter of a 250 billion gigawatt hours in a few years' time. But where do these batteries go? That's a very big number in terms of the battery side. And they go into a whole bunch of stuff. Currently, there are 40 gigawatt hours of batteries in electric vehicles globally, about 2 million electric vehicles. In the UK, we have 108,000 electric vehicles, and these are cars rather than buses. And it's about 1 in every 200 homes has an electric vehicle. And that's 2.2 gigawatt hours of battery. Now, typically, electric vehicle charges a third a day, about 10 kilowatt hours a day. People drive on average about 30 to 36 miles per day with any kind of vehicle. And that means an average house is about 10 kilowatt hours a day in the UK for electricity for non-heating. So in a simple metric, you could say an EV equals the same kind of energy per day as a house. So if 1 in 10 homes has an EV, then we have the need to build infrastructure for an extra 10% of homes. However, you can manage when these things charge in an ecosystem. Electric bicycles are kind of interesting. There's about 400,000 of them in the UK. And even though that's only 160 megawatt hours, it's still an interesting sort of group. But if you go to China, there's 200 million electric bicycles, about 50 gigawatt hours of batteries purchased for a different reason, mobility. And therefore, if you could control when all these batteries as a mass distributed swarm are charged, maybe when there's too much wind or too much solar, that's $50 billion of free money sitting there in terms of assets which could be utilised. Now, it's a control problem. How do you do that without having to talk or email or engage a customer? And that's why some of the patents and standards we work on are important to be in the policies and protocols, and even how things are powered. For example, when we ourselves sort of played with USB multi-voltage in 2008, we wired up our offices to power televisions and lights, and we worked out that if USB becomes pervasive, then virtually everything at IoT, which is low power, could be powered by a common plug. And when you get a plug right, it stays the same for a few decades. And policies around electricity are really interesting reference points. In the UK, there's also 350,000 mobility scooters, and there's a gigawatt hour of power in laptops every day. There's about a gigawatt hour across distributed small things like phones and tablets. And so if you can control when these things are charged, they're always maybe charged once a day. Now, a lot of these things are used at peak, always on at peak. And so Internet of Things is lots and lots of things always on all the time. And so we have a view that the actual electrification of everything is driving an increase in peak demand. Even though LED reduces some lighting efficiency, it's balanced by people having more 30 to 50 watt televisions on, more gaming devices on, more broadband on all day. If you take a high power device like a washing machine in a home, it's used 1/20th of the time. So it needs a kilowatt 5% of the time. And so across 20 homes, you should design a grid to have a kilowatt of supply for 20 homes, and that's called the grid or community asset. But putting a smaller battery and PV in the home to power the base load and to shift some peak load, or just controlling all the other batteries which are in the home as part of that collective ecosystem is very important. I put down robotics there because how many millions of batteries will be in robotics, robotics mechanical devices. You'll need a 1 or 2 kilowatt hour in a robot to make it useful function as a humanoid robot. So there's going to be lots of these fleets forming part of this collective ecosystem in the world, which our view is you can manage. Now, what we learn by putting in home batteries today is a perfect function because it's 100% available. I can push or pull independent of occupancy. It's not DSR. I'm not requiring a behavior change. It's independent of temperature. It's a battery I can push and pull. It's independent of whether someone's in or on holiday. Whereas heat demand response is more subjective in the sense it is available only at certain times. And behavioural DSR is very limited. Can I cancel Hinkley or Didcot B on the assumption that people are continuing to use things in a certain way into the future? It's not a piece of copper. It's very difficult. One of the challenges we have as a company is not really hardware, although we make hardware. It's very predictable, chemistry, lifespan. What's difficult is to predict how do I keep doing what we're doing and aggregating these things decade on decade. I have to build business models assuming Uber's not going to last the year, or Android doesn't exist in 2022, or Wi-Fi doesn't exist. How do I still connect these distributed billions of assets? I call it the fax machine problem. If today I was managing all the fax machines, that's my problem. Fax machines are outdated technology. One way the electricity markets have done is to make assets dumb, copper in the ground, or use Modbus or very simple technologies to manage things. If you make something smart, it's got to be like the internet. It's got to upgrade itself and persist. And this is one of the reasons we think some of these sort of maybe slightly faddish but also important technologies like blockchain are important, not because they can disintermediate and replicate a today business model, because they can do things you couldn't do with other technologies. That's a good technology for persistency. How do I keep doing things? Mathematics doesn't change. Languages change. The availability of certain programmers change. I remember Accenture, we did a lot of COBOL programming because they had lots of legacy insurance systems which are incredibly difficult to breathe upon. Utility companies, if you touch an IT system, that's 100 million quid. It's very, very expensive to maintain complex infrastructures. So you've got to think forward using the standards to be able to do this. And if you get it right, then you could basically manage all these resources as a collective resource for the wider system. And our view of the future is there are so many batteries in technologies, in Internet of Things, 50 billion things, that if you group them, they can help balance the grid. They don't solve everything. You still need other technology to do long outages. You can't store energy easily in the summer unless you put it into a fuel to use in the winter. So solar and battery is very good, but it doesn't solve all the problems. A battery is a solar battery in the summer. It's a grid battery in the winter, and it's a services battery. But there's lots of batteries everywhere. So we're interested to manage those for the greater value of the system. Thank you.